Amos Tillery's page was the only one still blank. 60 other signatures had already dried on the Meridian contract, dark and certain in the lamplight. A neighbor slid the pen across the table toward him, and the room chuckled, low and easy, the way men laugh at a thing already decided. Amos did not reach for the pen. He did not argue. He only turned the contract over to its back page, held it up to the lantern, and began to read. The company man watched him do it. Then he smiled at the crowd and said it plain. "Old man, you're the only fool in 3 townships who can't read progress." 61 farmers had signed by noon. Amos's own son-in-law looked at the floor. Amos wet the stub of a pencil against his lip. He drew one slow line under a single clause near the bottom, the buyback, it said, at grades to be determined by the company. He looked at that line a long moment. He did not say what it meant. He folded the paper into his coat. If you believe old hands know things young eyes can't see, this story is for you. Before we go on, if stories like this one mean something to you, take a second and subscribe and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I like knowing who's out there listening. Now, let me tell you about Amos Tillery and the autumn the whole county laughed at him. It was 1931, in the Cedar Fork bottoms in Coldwater Township, Nebraska. The corn had come in cheap that fall. Cheaper than any man there could remember. A bushel of good yellow corn fetched less than the twine it took to bind the stalks, and everybody knew it, and nobody could say why the world had decided their year of sweat was worth so little. The bank over in Coldwater had failed in the spring, just closed its doors one Tuesday and did not open them again. The men who'd kept their money there learned the word for it slow. Standing on the sidewalk, reading a paper sign. Gone. Not stolen exactly, just gone. So there was no cash. Not in Cedar Fork, not in the county, not near. A man paid the mercantile in eggs and butter and promises. Notes were coming due all across the plains, and out west of them, past the 100th meridian, the dust had already started to lift off the dry counties in brown clouds you could see from the train. Everybody in Cedar Fork was one bad harvest from the auctioneer's flag. They knew it. They lay awake with it. Amos Tillery was 63 that fall. He was a widower. His Della had been gone 11 years, and he still set her chair back from the table a little, the way she'd liked it. He farmed a quarter section on the bottoms, corn and wheat, 160 acres his father had broken with a walking plow and a mule 60 years before. The deed to that ground sat in a tin box in his loft, and there was not $1 owed against it. Not to a bank. Not to a company. Not to any living man. Amos had held it that way for 40 years, and he meant to hold it that way till they carried him off it. He was a plain man. I want you to see him plain, because the county saw him plain too, and mistook it. He was not clever with his mouth. He spoke about as often as a fence post, and when he did speak it came out flat and slow. One word set down after another like he was laying brick. He read slow. He'd tell you so himself. His lips moved when he read, and his finger followed the line. Some men took that for dull. They were wrong, but they took it that way, and Amos never troubled to correct them. Every fall, when the corn was in, Amos climbed the ladder to his loft with a lantern and did a thing his father had taught him. He picked his seed. Not just any ears, the best of them. The long straight ones off the strongest stalks, the ones that had stood up to wind and stood up to drought. He shelled them by hand into clean sacks, and he tied each sack. And he wrote on each one in pencil what it was and what field it came from. Open pollinated corn, they'd have called it, though Amos didn't call it anything but seed. His seed. Corn that had grown on his ground so long it had learned the ground. Next spring it would go back in, and it would come up knowing where it was. He'd never in his life bought a bushel of seed from a store. The notion would have struck him as strange as buying rain. That was Amos. Clear title, saved seed, a paid-up store account, and a mouth he kept shut. The county thought he was behind the times. The county was about to find out what behind the times could do. It was October when Harlan Voss came to Cedar Fork. He came in a black coupe with mud to the running boards, and he took a room at the hotel in Coldwater, and he put a notice in the paper and tacked bills to the posts outside the Grange hall. A meeting, the bills said. Free coffee. A word about the coming year and how a man might get ahead of it. Voss worked for the Consolidated Meridian Seed Grain Company, and he was their district agent, and he was good at what he did. I'll give him that much. He was very good. The night of the meeting, the Grange hall filled up. Every farmer in the bottoms came, and their wives, and half of them brought the children because there was nowhere to leave them. They lit the lanterns and hung them on the wall pegs, and the light swung a little in the draft, and the room smelled of wet wool and coffee and the coal oil smoke. Amos came too. He came late, and he sat in the back, on the last bench, near the door, with his hat on his knee. Voss stood up front by a little table. He was a young man to Amos's eye, maybe 40. With a clean collar and a way of leaning toward you when he talked, like what he had to say was just for you, just between the two of you, even with 100 people in the room. He didn't start with the seed. He started with the trouble. He talked about the failed bank. He talked about 11-cent corn. He named it all out loud, the very things keeping them up nights, and he said it kind. Like a doctor naming a sickness, and the room leaned toward him because he understood. Then he told them there was a way out. The company, he said, had a new seed. A hybrid, he called it. Bred in a laboratory by men in white coats, crossed and crossed again until it made ears twice the size of anything their fathers grew. He held up a photograph. He passed around a dried ear near as long as a man's forearm, and it went hand to hand down the benches, and you could hear the men murmur when they felt the weight of it. That was one thing. But that wasn't the thing that sold them. The thing that sold them was the price. The company, Voss said, would advance the seed to them. On credit. No cash down, in a year when no man had cash. They'd plant it, grow it, and in the fall the company would buy it back. At a guaranteed price. He let that word sit. Guaranteed, $1.10 a bushel, printed right there in the contract, black on white, signed by the company. When the open market was paying 11 cents, the company was promising $1.10. 10 times over. It was not a fortune. But to men who were drowning, it was a rope, and Voss held it out over their heads and let them look at it. You could feel the room change. You could feel the fear go out of it and something else come in. Hope, I suppose. Or the thing that wears hope's coat. At the back, on the last bench, Amos Tillery raised his hand. Voss saw him. Yes, sir, question? Can I take one home? Amos said. To read it proper. There was a little pause, and then Clem Doss laughed. Clem was up near the front. He was the co-op chairman, a big man, red-faced and hearty, and he farmed the biggest place in the bottoms, and he liked being looked at. He turned around on his bench so the room could enjoy it with him. Give him a week, Harlan, Clem said. Amos reads slower'n he plows, and he plows slower'n his daddy's mule. The hall laughed with him. Even some of the wives. Amos sat there and let it wash over him, and his face did not move at all, and when it was done he said again, quiet, just to read it. Voss brought him a copy himself, walked it all the way to the back, and handed it over with both hands like it was a gift. Take all the time you need, sir, he said, smiling, and the smile said the opposite. Amos folded the paper once and set it inside his coat, against his chest, and he stayed for the rest of it, though he did not take any coffee. That was the vault, though nobody in that hall knew it. A slow man taking a contract home to read. They'd told it as a joke for years after. Some of them tell it still. Sign-up day was the next week, at the same hall, in the same lantern light. They came to sign the way you'd come to a fair. There was that lightness on them. Voss had a good pen and a bottle of ink and a ledger, and the men lined up, and one by one they sat down across from him and put their names to the note. Clem Doss went first. because Clem always went first. He signed for his whole section, 640 acres of the best ground in the bottoms. And when he stood up, he clapped Voss on the shoulder like they were old friends, and Voss laughed and shook his hand, and the men in line grinned to see the chairman lead the way. After Clem, it went easy. A man doesn't want to be the one holding back when the chairman's already in. Earl Doss signed. That was Amos's own son-in-law, married to Ruth, Amos's only living child. Earl was 34 and he had a young man's hunger in him, and he signed for 200 acres and already had a look on his face like he was spending the money. A young farmer named Pruitt signed, and Pruitt could hardly wait his turn. He'd taken to following Voss around all week, agreeing with everything the man said. And when he sat down to sign, he said something about being glad to farm with modern men at last, and Voss told him he had a good head on him, and Pruitt colored up proud as a boy. One after another. The pen scratching. The lantern light swinging soft on the wall. By noon, the ledger had 61 names in it. Then Amos came in. He'd waited till most of it was done. He came in with his hat off and the folded contract in his hand, and he walked up the middle of the hall to the table, and something about the way he came made the room go quieter than it had been. He did not sit down. He unfolded his copy. He'd carried it a week, and it showed. The creases were soft and gray, and there were pencil marks on it here and there, faint lines under this word and that. Amos, Voss said. Pleasant. You've read it then, ready to sign with your neighbors? Amos didn't answer that. He put on the spectacles he kept in his breast pocket, the ones with the wire that hooked behind the ears. He held the paper up to the light, and in that flat, slow voice, laying one word after another, he read 3 lines out loud to the room. He read the buyback line first, the guaranteed $10. Only he read the whole of it, the part Voss's mouth had skipped past, that the price was guaranteed for corn at grades to be determined solely by the company. He read it twice. He let the word solely hang there. Then he read the second line, that the seed was not a gift and not a sale, but a note, money owed, and that the note was secured by a lien upon the crop. A lien, he said, and then, because some of the younger men wouldn't know the word, he said it plainer. That means they've got a claim on the corn before you do. It's theirs first. You grow it, but it answers to them. Then he read the third line. His finger was on it. He read that if the note came up short, if for any reason the crop didn't cover what was owed, the company could take possession of the pledged crop and any chattels and real property named herein. He lowered the paper. Chattels, he said. That's your teams, your machines, your tools. He paused. Real property. That's your ground. For a moment, nobody said anything at all. And then Voss laughed. He laughed easy and warm, and he spread his hands to the room like a man apologizing for a child. Gentlemen, he said, you've got a lawyer in the bottoms. Who knew? A few of the men laughed, relieved to laugh, glad to be told there was nothing to it. Mr. Tillery, Voss went on, those are standard terms. Every contract in America has language like that. The grade clause protects the company from having to pay top dollar for spoiled corn. You wouldn't sell a man rotten grain and expect a prime price, would you? The lien's just how credit works. And that last part, why, that only ever matters if a man defaults, and none of you good men are going to default, are you? Not at $1.10 a bushel. He turned to Amos, and his voice dropped, and here came the line he'd been saving. Old man, you're the only fool in 3 townships who can't read progress. The hall laughed. It laughed loud this time, because the fear was gone and the laughing felt good. Clem Doss laughed loudest of all and slapped his knee. And Amos Tillery stood in the middle of that laughing room, an old man with soft creases in his paper and his spectacles catching the lantern light, and he did not laugh. And he did not argue. And he did not sign. He folded the contract back along its worn creases. He put it in his coat. He looked once around the room, at the 61 of them, at Clem, at Earl, who would not raise his eyes, at young Pruitt still flushed with Voss's praise. Whatever he thought, he kept it. He put his hat back on. He turned and walked the length of the hall and out the door into the cold, and they heard his wagon creak. And the slow clop of his team going home, and inside the hall the pen went back to scratching. There was still a little line of men left to sign. The county rode high that fall and into the winter. You never saw such a thing. It was like somebody had let the air back into them. With a guaranteed price coming, a man felt rich before he'd grown a kernel. Earl Doss went into Coldwater and ordered himself a tractor, a new one, red, on a payment plan, on the strength of that $10 note that hadn't paid him a cent yet. He wasn't the only one. 2 other men ordered machines. The harness shop sold gear it hadn't moved in 3 years. And the granary. This is the part to hold on to. The granary over in Coldwater started issuing what they called advance scrip. Little printed slips. A man with a Meridian note could take his contract to the granary and draw scrip against next fall's guaranteed money and spend the scrip at the stores like cash. The whole county started spending a harvest that was still just a promise on paper. It moved through Cedar Fork like a warm wind. It felt like the hard times had finally broke. And everywhere Amos went, they needled him. They didn't mean it cruel, most of them. That's the thing you have to understand. It was the easy ribbing of men who felt smart and wanted the one holdout to feel foolish. He'd come into the mercantile for coffee and coal oil, paying in coin, and somebody by the stove would call over. "Still farming like it's 1890, Amos?" And the men would grin. Or, "Saved your little seed sacks again this year, did you?" "My corn's coming from a laboratory, Amos," scientists that got a laugh every time. Amos would set his coin on the counter and take his goods and say next to nothing. Word scarcity was just how he was built. Silence was his whole answer, and they took the silence for defeat, and it pleased them. He said it out loud exactly once that whole winter, and only to Ruth. His daughter came by the home place one gray afternoon to bring him a pie and to press him, gentle the way she'd been pressing him since the meeting. "Sign, Papa, everyone's signing. Why do you have to be the one?" Amos was at his kitchen table cleaning the spectacles on his shirt tail. He heard her out. Then he said the one thing. "A price you don't set isn't a price, Ruthie." He held the spectacles up to the window to check them. "It's bait." She didn't understand him. She wanted her father not to be the county joke, and here he was talking in riddles about bait. She left the pie and drove home a little short with him, and that was the winter. The whole bottom's drunk on a promise, and one old man in a cold kitchen saying the price was bait, and nobody with ears to hear it. It came to a head, in the family, on a Sunday in the spring. Ruth and Earl had Amos to dinner, the way they did most Sundays. Ruth cooked her mother's chicken and dumplings, and the new tractor sat gleaming in the yard where Earl could see it out the window while he ate, and Earl was in high color that day. He'd got the machine's papers back from the dealer, all stamped and official, and he laid them out on the oilcloth right there at the table, proud as a man showing off a newborn. He talked about the acres he'd break with it, the time he'd save, the money coming in the fall. Ruth was happy to see him happy. The children were underfoot. It was a good table, warm and full, and it should have been an easy afternoon. Ruth started in on her father again over the dumplings. She'd worked herself up to it. She told him people were talking. She told him it shamed the family, him the only man in the bottoms not to sign, him being made sport of at the store, her own husband's kin laughing behind their hands. She said it with tears standing in her eyes because she loved him and could not for her life see why he'd do this to them. "Just sign it, Papa, please, for me, so we can hold our heads up." Amos set down his fork. He reached inside his coat, which he'd kept on, and he brought out the folded contract, soft now as cloth from all the handling. And he laid it flat on the oilcloth beside Earl's shiny tractor papers. He took the pencil stub from his pocket. He put the point of it under one line, the grade clause, the solely by the company line, and he held it there. "Read that one, Earl," he said. "Just that one line. Out loud. For Ruthie." Nobody looked. That's the part that stays with me. Earl glanced at the paper and then away, out the window at his tractor, and he said, "Aw," "Amos, we've been over it, that's just how these things are wrote," and he went back to his dinner. Ruth looked at her father's hands, not the paper, at his old cracked knuckles holding that pencil so steady, and she just shook her head, disappointed, and got up to fill the children's plates. The contract lay there between the dumplings and the tractor papers, and not one soul at that table would read the line. Amos looked at it a while longer. Then he folded it up and put it away. He thanked Ruth for the dinner, and he had not eaten but a few bites, and he got his hat and went out to his wagon and drove home in the long spring light, alone. Past field after field where his neighbors were laying in the company's laboratory seed. He didn't try again after that. That was Amos's flaw, if you want to call it one, and it's worth naming, because it's the flaw that let the whole county walk off the cliff. He believed a plain warning, spoken once, plain, was enough. He'd read them the lines in the hall. He'd laid the paper on his own daughter's table. He figured he'd done his part, and a man who wouldn't hear couldn't be made to hear, and so he went quiet and went home and tended to his own. He would not beg them. Maybe he should have. But begging wasn't in him, and so the warning sat unheard, and the county planted. Now here is where I want you to watch him alone. Because while the bottoms buzzed and spent their scrip and dreamed on the $10, Amos Tillery did what he'd done every spring of his life, and did it by himself, and it looked like nothing at all. It wasn't strategy. Understand that. He wasn't scheming against anybody. He was just being what he'd always been. In a year when what he'd always been happened to matter. Nights, he climbed to the loft with the lantern and brought down his seed. The labeled sacks off the rafters, the best ears of last year's corn shelled clean and dry. He sat on an upturned crate in the barn and ran the kernels through his fingers, sorting the way his father had shown him, the plump from the shriveled, the sound from the cracked. And the lantern threw his big slow shadow up the barn wall. He wasn't buying a thing from the company. There was nothing to sign for, nothing owed. His corn would come off his own rafters and go into his own ground, same as always. He went into the mercantile that spring for the little he needed, some coffee, some flour, a new file for the plow, and he paid for it in coin, hard money. Counted out on the counter. No scrip. When the man asked him, didn't he want to draw against his note like everybody else, Amos said he had no note, and paid his coin, and carried his goods out to the wagon. And the granary man came out to the home place one afternoon in a suit, hunting business, offering Amos advance scrip against a Meridian contract if only he'd sign one, easy money. Everybody's doing it. Amos was mending harness on the porch. He heard the man out. Then he said 7 words. No scrip, no note, cash or nothing. And he went back to the harness, and after a while the granary man got in his car and drove off, and that was the end of that. 3 small things. Saving his seed. Paying in coin. Turning down the scrip. Nobody saw him do them, and if they had they'd have laughed again. But those 3 quiet things were the whole difference between Amos Tillery and every man who'd laughed at him, and the year was going to prove it. By late spring the seed was in the ground across the whole of Cedar Fork. The company's hybrid in 61 fields, and Amos's saved corn in his 160 acres of bottom ground, and that same week Amos finished his planting and squared his last account and covered his settlement at the store in cash, down to the penny. When the last coin left his hand, he owed no man in the world $1, and no company a kernel. He went home to a paid-up place and a clear deed and slept, I expect, as sound as he ever had. The rains were kind at first. The corn came up all across the bottoms in long green rows, and the company's hybrid came up thick and tall, taller than Amos's, that was plain to any eye that looked across the section road. It shot up dark and heavy and proud. And the county looked at it and looked at old Amos's shorter, plainer rows and felt sure all over again. There, they said. There's your science, Amos. There's your laboratory corn against your daddy's mule corn. Even Ruth, driving past her father's field, felt a little easier in her mind, felt maybe the mockers had the right of it after all, and was half ashamed of how relieved that made her. The hybrid stood green and tall in the July sun, and the whole county gloated, and it looked for all the world like Amos Tillery had backed the wrong horse in the 1 year he could least afford to. And then the first circular came from Meridian. It came in the mail, a printed sheet to every man who'd signed. It was headed with the company's name, and it was written in the cool, flat language of an office far away. It reminded them, in case they'd forgotten, of the terms of delivery. To earn the guaranteed price, the circular said, the harvested corn was to be hauled to the company's own elevator, not the county granary, the company's elevator, 40 miles off. And there it would be inspected and graded by the company's own men. And only corn that graded, the sheet said, no, 2 or better, would earn the guaranteed $1.10. It named a date. The settlement date. 90 days off. All accounts under the contract to be settled, in full, on that day. Most men read the circular once and set it aside. Delivery terms. Nothing to fret over. Their corn was tall and green, wasn't it? Course it'd grade no. 2. Course it would, and better. They went back to their fields. But out on the Cedar Fork bottoms, an old man sat by his window in the long evening light with a soft gray contract unfolded on his knee. He'd read it before. He read it again anyway, slow, his lips moving, his finger on the line, the grade clause and the lien, and the chattels and land. 90 days. He looked up from the paper and out the window at the county's corn standing dark and tall against the sundown, all that green promise leaning in the wind. He didn't say a word. There was no one to say it to. He folded the paper along its worn creases and set it on the sill and watched the light go down over 61 fields that did not yet know what they were. The summer wore on, and the county was proud of itself. The Meridian corn came up thick. It came up faster than anything the bottoms had grown in a lifetime, tall and dark and even, row on row of it. And the men who'd signed drove out on Sundays just to look at it. They leaned on their fence posts and looked at that corn the way a man looks at money he hasn't spent yet. Clem Doss said it was the finest stand in 3 townships. Earl Doss said it out loud at the diner, that his father-in-law had gambled his whole crop on hollow seed his own daddy scraped out of the crib. And look at it now. Look at that scrawny open field on the bottoms next to the company corn. Somebody laughed. It was easy to laugh that summer. And Amos said nothing. He worked his own ground the way he always had. His corn was shorter. It was not as even. It bore the marks of seed a man saves himself, some ears fat and some ears lean, the way real things come. He hoed it, and he watched the sky, and he kept his own counsel, and in the long evening he sat by his window with the soft gray contract on his knee and read it one more time, though he knew every word of it by heart. 90 days. The circular had named the settlement date, and the date was coming. Then the rain didn't come. It held off a week past when it should have, and then another. The wind came instead. It came out of the west, hot and steady, the kind of wind the old men in Coldwater had started to call the dust wind, though the dust was still counties away. It streaked across the bottoms, and it laid its hot hand on all that fine green corn. The company corn drank hard and grew fast, and that was the trouble. It had grown too fast on too little. When the ears filled, they filled soft. They filled pale. A man named Pruitt was the first to notice. He was young, and he'd been the loudest of Voss's admirers, the one who called himself a modern man. He pulled an ear one August morning and shucked it in his hand and stood looking at it. The kernels were there. But they were light in color, chalky, and they gave a little under the thumb when they should have been hard as flint. He told himself it was one bad ear. He shucked another. Then he stood a long time in his own field and did not tell anybody anything. The harvest came in heavy. That was the cruel part. The company seed yielded more bushels to the acre than the bottoms had ever seen. The cribs filled and overflowed, and for 2 days the county let itself believe again, because there is nothing like a full wagon to quiet a man's fear. They hauled it. The circular had said haul it to the company elevator, 40 miles off, and so they hauled it. Wagon after wagon down the Coldwater road in a long dusty line, the whole county's harvest rolling toward the guaranteed price. And at the company elevator, the company's own men stood at the scale with the company's own grading book, and they turned the corn down. Load after load. No. 3, they said. Feed grade. Soft off color, underweight for no. 2. They read it out flat, the way Voss read things, a man behind a counter telling you a fact you couldn't argue with. Number 3 corn didn't earn $1.10. Number 3 corn earned what feed corn earned that fall, which was next to nothing, which was 11 cents on the bad days, and there was a line in the contract, they said, and the line was plain. And the line was this: the guaranteed price was for grades to be determined solely by the company. Clem Doss stood at that scale and argued for an hour. He was chairman. He'd signed the biggest acreage in the county. He told the grader the corn was sound, that he'd farmed 40 years and knew sound corn, and the grader looked at him with no unkindness at all and said, "That may be. But it grades no 3, and turned to the next wagon. They drove home with their corn. Now here is the thing the county hadn't let itself understand, all that green summer. The corn had been advanced to them on a note. Every man had signed a note for his seed, secured against his crop, and that note came due on the settlement date whether the corn graded no. 2 or no. 3 or nothing at all. The feed grade money didn't cover 1/10 of the notes. Not 1/10. A man who'd signed for 200 acres owed the full sum and had a crib full of corn the company wouldn't buy at the price it had promised, and 11-cent corn on the open market that wouldn't cover the hauling. Earl Doss sat at his own kitchen table with the numbers and could not make them come out. He was 34. He had a new tractor in the shed, bought on the strength of the guaranteed price, its papers under the oilcloth right where he'd shown them off. He added the note and the tractor payment and the winter ahead, and he added them again, and Ruth watched his face and knew before he said a word. The letters started coming from the district office, not from Voss. Voss was gone from the county by then, off to sign up the next 3 townships, and the men who tried to reach him got form letters back, printed sheets in that same cool, flat office language. The letters said the notes would be settled per the terms of the contract on the date named. They said the company was aware certain deliveries had graded below no. 2. They said this did not alter the obligation. They were sorry for any hardship. They were, the letter said, respectfully. That was the first layer of it. The grade clause. The guarantee had never been a guarantee of a price. It had been a guarantee of a price for corn the company alone got to say was good enough, and the company said almost none of it was. Amos had read that line aloud in the lantern light back in the spring, 3 lines from the back page, in his flat, slow voice, and 61 men had signed anyway. Then came the second layer, and it was worse. Because the notes weren't covered by the feed grade money, they stood in default. And the contract, the same contract, the one Amos folded into his coat and carried out to his wagon alone, that contract said the seed advance was secured by a lien on the crop. A lien. It meant the company had a claim on the corn itself, standing or cribbed, before the farmer had claim to $1 of it. The corn wasn't the farmer's to sell for what he could get. It was pledged. And when the note came up short, Meridian filed on the lien, county-wide, in 1 week and sent its trucks and its men to take possession of the crop that stood in the fields and the crop that sat in the cribs. They came to Pruitt's place first. He watched them load his corn, off his own ground, out of his own crib, onto a company truck, and he stood in his yard and didn't say anything either, the way Amos hadn't said anything all summer. Only now it was a different kind of quiet. And then the third layer, the one nobody had believed could be real. The default clause, the chattels and real property line. Amos had read that one too, that spring, the whole room going still around him, that on default the company could take possession of the pledged crop, and any chattels and any real property named in the note. Chattels meant the teams and the wagons and the new tractors. Real property meant the ground, the acreage a man had put down on his note as security. Back when the guaranteed price made it all look like nothing, that ground now stood forfeit against a debt the man could not pay. It went to the county recorder. Every filing. The Coldwater recorder was an old man himself, careful, and he went through the Meridian papers one at a time with his spectacles down on his nose. And what he found he told plainly to anyone who asked. The filings were airtight. Every one. The liens were properly recorded, the notes were properly signed, and every one of them was dated the same day. The day they'd signed in the Grange hall, in the lantern light, while an old man folded his copy and walked out to his wagon. The paper had been perfect from the first hour. It had only been waiting. That was when the county went back and dug out its copies. They'd shoved them in drawers, most of them, under the tractor papers and the seed circulars, and they pulled them out now in their kitchens by lamplight and read them the way Amos had read them, slow, a finger on the line. And there it all was, not hidden, not in fine print smaller than the rest, not buried in a fold. Right there on the back page in the same plain type, the grade clause, the lien, the chattels and real property. The exact 3 lines the old man had read aloud to their faces. They had heard him read it. They had laughed while he read it. Clem Doss had clapped the agent on the back while the words were still in the air. Ruth found her father's warning in her own memory before she found the clause on the page. She remembered him at their Sunday table, laying the contract on the oilcloth, pointing at one line with a stub of pencil, and she remembered that nobody had looked, that she herself had asked him to please, for once, stop shaming the family. She sat in her kitchen with Earl's copy in her hands and read the line his pencil had pointed to, and she put her hand over her mouth. The settlement date came on a cold, bright morning in the fall. They held the first auction at the Doss place because Clem had signed the biggest and defaulted the biggest, and because a chairman's fall draws a crowd. The auctioneer's flag went up over the yard where, a season before, the men had stood and clapped for progress. They stood in that same yard now. The same men, 61 of them or near it, come to watch one of their own go under because they all knew their own morning was coming next. Meridian's man read the seizure list from the porch steps. He read it in the flat office voice, and the list was long. The section of ground, the teams, the implements, the new tractor. He read Clem Doss's 40 years off a printed sheet, item by item, and Clem stood at the bottom of his own porch steps with his hat in his 2 hands. And across the section road, plain as anything in the cold, clear light, stood Amos Tillery's place. His crib was full, not overflowing. He'd grown no miracle corn, but full, sound, his own, flint hard-open pollinated corn he could sell or hold or seed as he pleased, owing no lien on a kernel of it. His teams grazed his own clear ground behind them. His deed sat in a tin box in his loft the way it had sat for 40 years. The 2 things stood there together in the one frame, the auction flag on one side of the road and the full crib on the other, and there was not a man in the yard who couldn't see both by turning his head. Clem Doss was called on to answer whether the property was as described. He said it was. His voice came out of him rough. And then he said the only thing he had left to say, half to the company man and half to nobody, that the price had been printed, plain as day, $1.10 printed right there on the front of the paper, and how was a man to know? He said it like a defense. It came out like a sentence he was reading against himself. And when he'd said it, he looked across the road, once at the full crib and the grazing teams, and then he could not look at it anymore, and he put his eyes on his own boots and kept them there. Earl Doss stood off to the side and watched them roll the new tractor up onto the company truck. He'd shown its papers off at his own table. He'd shown them to the old man who tried to warn him. He watched it go up the ramp, the paint still bright on it. And Ruth stood beside him with her hand on his arm, holding on, and neither of them said a word. That was where the cost of it lived. Not in the numbers on the recorder's sheet. In a young man watching a bright new thing he couldn't pay for, hauled off in front of his wife, and knowing whose fault it was. And knowing whose warning he'd waved away. Then the young farmer, Pruitt, did a thing nobody expected. He climbed up on the porch steps where the company man had read the list, and he had his own copy of the contract in his hand, and he began to read it aloud. His voice shook. He read the guaranteed price off the front, the $1.10 that had bought them all. And then he turned it over, the way he'd once laughed to see Amos turn it over, and he read the back page. He read the grade clause. He read it out to the whole silent yard, grades to be determined solely by the company, and his voice broke clean in half on the word solely, and he stood there on the steps and finished it anyway. Finished the very sentence the old man had started in the lantern light half a year before, and when he was done there was no sound in the yard at all. 61 men, and not one of them laughed. There was no one left to laugh at. Amos was not there. He didn't come to the auction. He wasn't a man to stand in a yard and watch his neighbors brought low so that anyone could see him watching. He stayed on his own ground that morning and did his own chores. But he came after. In the afternoon, when the crowd had thinned and the company truck had gone and the Doss place stood stripped and quiet, an old wagon came up the lane, and it was Amos, and the wagon bed was full of seed sacks. His own saved seed, open pollinated corn out of his loft, out of the labeled sacks in his rafters. Enough to replant come spring for any family that would put it in the ground and work it. He didn't say much. He never had. He backed the wagon up to Earl's empty porch, the porch Ruth and Earl had already had to give notice on, and he began to unload the sacks one at a time, setting them down easy, and he did it without being asked and without a speech. Ruth came out onto the porch and stood there. She didn't say anything either. She just watched her father's back bend and straighten, setting down the seed, and after a minute she came down the steps and took the next sack out of his hands and carried it up herself. Clem Doss was standing in his own emptied yard across the way. Amos took one sack off the wagon and carried it over the section road the whole way and set it down at Clem's feet. Clem Doss, who had mocked him worst, who had signed the biggest and clapped the agent on the back and called him a fool who read slower than he plowed. Amos set the sack down in front of him and straightened up. The two old men stood there a moment in the cold, and Amos said the only thing he said all that day. Read it slower next year. That was all. No, I told you so. No triumph in it. He said it the way you'd tell a man to mind the ice on the step. Then he turned and walked back across the road to his wagon and his chores, and Clem Doss stood looking down at a sack of seed from the one man in the county who still had seed to give, and something in the chairman's face came apart that pride had held together for 40 years. It wasn't the losing that broke him. He could have stood the losing. It was the seed at his feet and the plain quiet words and no gloating in them anywhere. The mercy is what finished him. The mercy is also, in the end, what saved him. A Coldwater lawyer had the last plain word on it. He'd been hired by 3 of the ruined families, hoping there was something in the papers to fight, some flaw, some hook to hang a case on. He went through it all, the notes, the liens, the recorder's filings, the grade clause, every line, and he came into the Coldwater diner one evening that winter, and men asked him, and he set his hat on the counter and told them straight. There was nothing to fight. The contract was legal from the first word to the last. The company had done nothing but hold men to what they'd signed. And then he said the thing they'd all come to know but hadn't heard spoken by a man of the law. He said the one farmer in this whole county who sat down and read the entire contract before he signed anything, the one man who read past the guaranteed price on the front page all the way to the clauses on the back, is the one man out here still holding his title free and clear. Every other man in 3 townships signed the front page and never turned it over. One man turned it over. And that one man, gentlemen, is the only one of you the company can't touch." He picked his hat back up and left, and the diner sat quiet a while. The spring came, the way it does, whether men have earned it or not. It came green over the Cedar Fork bottoms, and it came green in a dozen fields where a season before there'd been nothing but a seizure notice and a stripped shed. Amos's saved seed went into that ground. His open pollinated corn, the flint-hard homely kind that some ears fat and some ears lean, the kind a man can save again next fall and the fall after that, and owe no company a dollar for the privilege. It came up in Earl and Ruth's field. It came up in Pruitt's. It even came up in the rented half-section Clem Doss worked now. Because Clem had planted the sack Amos set at his feet, and he'd read the seed catalog slower that year, and everything else. Ruth came back to her father's table. She came ashamed, at first, the way a child comes back who has learned a hard thing too late. But he set a plate for her and pushed her mother's old chair a little closer. The chair that had stood pushed back from the table 11 years, and he didn't say a word about any of it. In the fall, she climbed the loft ladder with him, and he showed her how he sorted the seed and labeled the sacks, the good ears from the poor, the way his own father had taught him, and she learned to do it in her own hand. So it would carry. So somebody would still know how, when the old man was gone. The Grange hall where they'd signed stood empty a long while. No company rented it after that. The county had had its lesson in what comes to a lantern-lit room where a smooth man promises a price you don't set. When they used the hall again, it was for their own doings, their own dances, and their own votes. And no printed sheet from an office 40 miles off was ever spread on that signing table again that anyone can recall. Clem Doss worked his rented ground and made his crop and paid his rent, and he grew quieter than he'd been. Somebody at the diner asked him once, careless, what he made of the whole Meridian business all that time gone by. Clem didn't rise to it the way the old Clem would have. He just looked out the window a while. Then he said the only verdict he ever gave on it. Should have listened to the old man. That was all. And nobody argued. Amos Tillery farmed his bottoms until his hands gave out, and the deed stayed in the tin box in the loft, clear the day he passed it on, as it had been the day his father broke the ground. He never made a speech about any of it. He'd said his piece once, in a lantern-lit hall, in his flat, slow voice. 3 lines off the back page of a contract, and that had been enough for one man and not enough for 60. And he'd learned something, too, that spring. That a warning is worth no more than the ears that will bend to hear it. You can read a thing plain and true to a whole room, and the room can laugh, and there's no help for it but to go home and put your own seed in your own ground and wait for the season to teach what you couldn't. The county learned it the hard way. Most things get learned the hard way or not at all. But they did learn it. That's the part worth keeping. They mocked the farmer who wouldn't sign. And the mocking cost them everything they had, and the man they mocked came up their lanes afterward with seed in his wagon and no unkindness in his mouth. And that is how a whole county came to know what an old man had known all along, that a price you don't set isn't a price, it's bait. And that the quiet men who read the whole page before they put their name to it are worth listening to, even when they read slower than they plow. Old hands know things young eyes can't see. Cedar Fork found that out in a single hard year, in a hall by lantern light, on the back page of a contract nobody but one man bothered to turn over. If there's a town near you where the old folks still tell about the year the seed company came through and what it cost, comment your city and let the rest of us know we're not the only ones who remember. Come spring, you could see it if you drove the Cedar Fork road slow enough. The corn coming up in Earl and Ruth's east field, not the glossy Meridian hybrid that had gone in the year before, but the open pollinated variety Amos had saved for 40 years, stocky and plain and exactly what it looked like, no guarantee on it, but the seed and the ground, and the man who understood both. Ruth was out there in the early morning light, walking the rows the way her father had taught her to walk them when she was small enough that the seed corn came up to her shoulder. She wasn't walking them like a woman who knew what she was looking at, not yet. But she was walking them, and that was the start of knowing. She came up to the loft on a Saturday in late April with a notebook and a pencil, the way a student comes to a lesson she's ashamed she needs. Amos didn't make a ceremony of it. He showed her how he labeled the sacks, the variety name, the year the seed was saved, the germination rate he'd tested in a damp cloth on the kitchen table in February. He showed her how he hung them so the air moved through. He told her which ears he selected from, the straightest cobs off the strongest stalks from the driest corner of the field, the ones that had earned their place in the next year's planting by proving themselves in this one. He said it all in his flat voice, the same way he'd said the 3 clauses in the lantern-lit hall, like a man reading a thing that is simply true and needs no decoration. Ruth wrote it down. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't need to say it, and he didn't need to hear it said. She sat in his loft with seed corn all around her and a pencil in her hand and wrote down what he told her. And that was apology and forgiveness together in one act. The kind that sticks. Earl came up the lane that same afternoon, walking from the road because he had no tractor anymore. The company truck had taken it in December, the papers signed, the chattel named. He was doing day labor now on the Hendricks place 2 miles east, 50 cents a day when there was work. He stood at the foot of the loft ladder and looked up at his wife writing in her notebook. And he looked at his father-in-law among the labeled sacks, and he said the most honest thing he'd said in 2 years, that he should have read the page. Amos looked at him a moment. Then he handed down a sack of the summer variety, 10 pounds of it, enough to put in the garden strip behind the house. "Plant it in the low corner," he said. "It runs a little wet there. This one handles wet." That was all he gave and all he said, and it was enough to plant on, and Earl knew it. Clem Doss worked a rented half-section the following year. Not his own ground. The deed to his own ground had gone into the recorder's office in January, clean and legal, exactly as the back page of the contract he'd signed had promised it could. He was not a small man, Clem. He'd been chairman of the co-op, he'd clapped Harlan Voss on the back in front of 60 neighbors, and there was something particular about the way a man like that learns to be small. He learned it 1 acre at a time, renting from a neighbor who had the grace not to say much about it. Clem was heard by 3 or 4 people at the Coldwater diner counter that following autumn to say only this, that a man ought to have listened to the old farmer. He said it looking at his coffee. He didn't say it where Amos could hear it, and Amos, if he had heard it, would have had nothing to add. The Grange hall changed, too, not dramatically. There were no proclamations, no public votes. It was quieter than that. When a man came through the following spring with a proposition, a milling arrangement with an elevator company out of Kearney, terms on 2 pages, good print, small, the chairman pro tem, a wheat farmer named Hartley, who had lost 300 acres in the Meridian seizure, did something the hall had never seen done before at a sign-up meeting. He read the whole thing. Out loud. All of it. He stumbled on a few of the legal phrases and had to go back, and nobody laughed. When he got to a clause he didn't understand, he said so, and the room waited. They waited 20 minutes while Hartley worked through it with the Coldwater lawyer who happened to be sitting in the back. The clause turned out to be standard and harmless. But they found out it was harmless because they read it, and that was new, and it was Amos Tillery's doing as surely as if he'd been sitting in the room, which he was not. He stayed on his own ground. He kept his own counsel. He farmed the Cedar Fork bottoms the way his father had farmed them, open-pollinated seed in labeled sacks in the loft. His own corn, and his own wheat, and his own numbers written in his own hand in the ledger by the kitchen window, owing no company $1, owing no elevator a note, holding his deed clear the way a man holds something he earned twice, once when he worked for it, and once when he refused to hand it over. The season taught what one man's word in a lantern-lit hall could not. That is how most things get taught. That is why the story is worth telling.